Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Next up is a dose of pure English humor, the dry one, Benny Hill, with Mark Proctor, and he's going to be talking about the cube formulas and how you can make your pivot tables not as rigid as pivot tables are. Mark Proctor.
Thank you, everyone. I can start my timer. That's my 40 minutes. We'll know whether I'm over or not. So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with so many other, well, people who I admire. So it's great to be here. And today we're talking about cube functions. Put the numbers where you want them. So cube functions. Anyone used cube functions before? A few? Good. There's some stuff about me, mildly interesting. But let's talk about cube functions. Actually, before we talk about cube functions, let's talk about squirrels. No, I didn't say SQL, I actually said squirrels. We will be talking about squirrels today a huge amount. Because the data set we're looking at is from the 2018 New York City Squirrel Census, everyone's favorite data set, where people went out into New York City and they recorded the date, the color, the age, the height, not of the squirrel, but how high they were up the tree, the activity, whether they were running, chasing, climbing, eating, foraging, and other types of activity. And this was all recorded in Central Park in New York as part of the Squirrel Census. So far today, we've had 0% squirrel-based presentations. We'll be at a solid 25% by the end of this session. So your daily allocated allowance for squirrel-based content will be massively exceeded. You'll have a very good squirrel-based day. So the data set that we're looking at here, does my mouse show up? It does. So we've got a date, a color ID, the age of the squirrel, their height above ground, and the activity rating. So the different kinds of activities that a squirrel could be undertaking at that point. They have a rating from 1 to 5 as to how many activities they are undertaking. And then we have the color table to show what color those squirrels are. Now, we've got our data. Where are we going to turn? We've got 3,023 sightings. Let's turn to a pivot table. We all love pivot tables. Look, I've even put a heart on the screen. They're easy, they're flexible. I've got a smiley face over here. Look at that. We love pivot tables. So let's go take a look. So here is my pivot table. I've got the dates on the left, and then the average height above ground, and then the average activity rating. Now, if you're a squirrel aficionado like I am, you know that we can't have any of these standard metrics. We need to create something, because if a squirrel is above ground and undertaking activities, that's like, it's doing double duty, isn't it? It's doing double effort. So I invented my own squirrel-based activity metric, and that is activity score. 1.3 times the square root of height above ground multiplied by the activity rating is the activity score. Now, this is not an official metric by any squirrel-based organization. This is just because I am a superfan. So we first asked the question, how can we add activity score into our pivot table? Well, we can't do that with a calculated field, so what we have to do is kind of add our calculation back into our source data. It's not a great option. How about the second item? Can we add a to-date calculation? So if we're on the 12th of October, what activity have our squirrels had up to the 12th of October? Well, we can't do year-to-date or month-to-date or to-date calculations inside the pivot table. We have to change our source data. What if I want to categorize by primary color? Well, over here, in my source data, I have a separate table of the color, which means if I want to put this into my pivot table, I have to change my source data. So when it comes to pivot tables, we have to change the data. Come on, we all know that's not the right option. So what started out as us loving pivot tables because they're easy, flexible, and quick makes us sad. It breaks our hearts because we have to say pivot tables lack the power that we need. So along comes Power Pivot. It has the word power in the name. It's got to be better just by its name, right? So let's take a look at a demo with Power Pivot. So there's the pivot table. This time, I've got my average activity score, my favorite squirrel-based activity metric, and using some DAX, I can add that into my pivot table. So pivot, Power Pivot, measures, manage measures. I think it's the first one. Look at that, I've managed to add in my own metric that works inside my pivot table. We have that there in that first column. So yes, I can create my average activity score in Power Pivot. My second challenge, can I add a month-to-date calculation? There's the DAX I'm going to use. Yes, I can create a month-to-date calculation using Power Pivot. Can I categorize this by primary color? Well, I can just go Insert, Slicer. I can select my primary color, click OK, and there I have a slicer, which means now, look at that, I can slice my favorite squirrel-based metric by different colors. Why you're not more excited is beyond me. This is squirrels we're talking about here, right? Come on, people. So we can easily connect up different tables, and that's because inside Power Pivot, we have our data model. So there you go, we've now been able to combine, we've got a calendar, we've got our sightings, we've got our colors, we've got our calculations over there. So using Power Pivot, we can create all the data that we need and all the calculations that we need about our squirrels. Now you might think, why are you so bothered about this, Mark? And that's because I've got to update my squirrel-based dashboard, right? I mean, and just in case you're wondering, this isn't just a visual. There we have my squirrel activity dashboard, which if anyone wants to copy this afterwards, you just let me know. You can easily slice it by color. Look at that. Pick different dates, secondary colors, got activity. Oh, believe me, if you love squirrels, this is one of the best things you've probably ever seen. So we've got our dashboard there. And then you might come along and say, I thought you were going to talk to us about cube functions. Why do we even need cube functions? Well, the problem is that when we come to Excel, any time that we deal with a pivot table, so there I've got the day of the week, the average activity score. Anytime we come to a pivot table, we've got a rigid tabular layout. It doesn't really mean we can't place things where we want. We can't really create the designs that we want. It's all based upon this rigid layout. Now, I know some of you are looking at this data and thinking, well, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, where's Tuesday, right? So I've thought about this and I've analyzed my data. And you'll notice Sunday has the highest squirrel activity rating. Monday has the second highest squirrel activity rating, which basically means on Tuesday they rest. Okay, that is the only possible conclusion from this data set. So they're so busy that they have a bit of time out on Tuesday. Anyway, we've got a pivot table here, but we can't place the numbers where we want them. But we can click on our pivot table, and then we can go to Pivot Table Analyze, Overlap Tools, and there's this option called Convert to Formulas. When we click that, suddenly our pivot table has disappeared, and we now just have formulas. And we can drag these things and place these things wherever we like. Now, you might be thinking, are they just hard-coded values? Well, if I click on the slicer, you'll see those numbers update, even though they are formulas from our data model. We've got two formulas in here. We've got the cube member function. We'll look at that in a few moments' time. This is another cube member function up here. We'll look at that as well. And then we have our cube value function. So they're the functions that we will be working with for our squirrel-based reporting. So when it comes to displaying values from a data model, we can use a pivot table, or we can use cube formulas. Now, I've used Power Pivot for this demo, but equally, we can connect to Power BI. So if we want to, we can connect into our Power BI data model, and we can also pull out, we can also reach into that data model using cube functions. And when it comes to cube functions, they're written in a language known as MDX. So the question often comes, well, how difficult is MDX to learn? It's a fair question, right? We've got Excel functions, they're reasonably simple. Office scripts, also not too bad. VBA gets a little bit trickier. Then we get to the mighty DAX. Oh, DAX, it looks so easy, but it's actually quite hard. With MDX, it's off the charts. Quite literally. I'm glad you laughed at my joke. I appreciate that. So these cube functions that we're looking at, we're going to look at 5 of them today: cube set, cube member, cube ranked member, cube set count, and cube value. We have 2 cube KPI member and cube member property that we're not looking at in our time together. So let's start with our cube member and cube value. Now, when we think about this piece around MDX and how we structure things, we've got this basic syntax up here: table, column, and element. So if you think about a dimension, we have a table where that dimension is, what column it is, and what item we want to get out. So if we wanted the days of the week, for example, from our calendar, we could select calendar, day name, and then children. And that would get us a list of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If we just wanted to get one item out, we've got our calendar day name, and then we could just say Monday. And then when we combine our cube member with a measure, so a calculation, we can then get a value out from our cube functions. So let's go and take a look. And we're going to start by building our cube functions from scratch. So we're not even going to use a pivot table and then convert them. We're going to go from scratch. Watch me create some horrific typos and for you to shout out where I've typed words incorrectly. So let's start with our cube member. We want to get the days of the week. So I'll type cube. There you go, there's the first one. There'll be, cube member. By the end of this, there'll be a marks typo metric, which will go on the dashboard somewhere. Whenever we use a cube function, we need to say what is the data set that we're looking at. Anytime we're using a Power Pivot, it's always this workbook data model. We can enter a dot, no, a comma even. Now, we've next got a member expression. That is the next element that we want. And the interesting thing about cube functions is that all these things are placed in double quotes, so they are always text, which gives us some interesting use cases. We get some IntelliSense. So for my calendar table, type a dot. It says, well, what column do you want? I'm going to use day name. And if I want to pull out a specific day in square brackets, I'll put that as Monday. I'll close my double quotes, close my bracket, and press return. And now that says Monday. Now, that doesn't just say Monday. Behind that is the dimensions that we need. Now, to save a bit of time, I'm not going to type out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'm going to let my mouse not copy things properly. So there we've got so there we've got Monday. The next one we'd want would be Tuesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So we'd need to hard code each of those words. Now the interesting one is if we want a total at the bottom, rather than a day of the week, we could use the word all, and that will bring out all of those elements from that dimension. So that's got our cube member. So that's got what we can filter our data set by. Now the measure that we want to use is also a cube member. Cube member. So again, we have to define where our data is. That's this workbook data model. Now, anytime that we want to get a measure or a calculation from DAX, it will always be in our measures table. It doesn't matter what table we've put it in, what table we've called it, that will always be in a table called measures. And there we have my two measures. Let me zoom in on that. There we have my two measures. So we have average activity score to date and average activity score. We're just going to use our average activity score. We'll close that double quotes. I've done something wrong. So that now gives me a connection to my average activity score calculation. So now by joining these cube members together using cube value, we can then return our calculation. So cube value. Again, we need to define this workbook data model. We're going to connect to our dimension, which was Monday. We're going to connect to our average activity score, close that bracket. I should dollarize this. That's for Jordan. We're talking about how we refer to as dollars. Dollarize, that's the new term everyone needs to know. That's the fancy term we're all using these days, dollarize. If you're not using that, you're not one of the cool kids. That now gets us all of the values out that we need from our data model. So we're now reaching into our data model and pulling out our values. Now before, when we had a pivot table or a power pivot, we were able to add a slicer. Can we add a slicer to our calculations? The answer is yes. So if we want to add a slicer, we go to Insert, go to Slicer, and then we click on, in this dialog box, we click on Data Model. It says I've got 4 tables. I click Open. That then gives me all the elements that I can create a slicer for. Now I've already created my slicer here. If we right-click on that slicer and go to Slicer Settings, it tells me the name of my slicer. So names to use in formulas, slicer underscore primary underscore color. So let's add that into our formula. So slicer underscore primary underscore color. We'll copy that down. And now when we slice, you can see that our formulas now update using a slicer. There's an interesting thing about cube formulas is that everything that we've seen to date in there, anytime that we reference a cube set, you can see here, calendar, day name, Monday, that is text. And because it's text, it means we can easily concatenate text to link to a specific cell with text. What we can also do is rather than having a cube member, we can take our member expression there. I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to insert that into, you get the annoying dialog box, place that into my formula, which means it's no longer referencing C6, press return, and that still calculates a value, which means, because this is text, I can then cell link C6, that still works, copy that down. In case you're worried that I've cheated, if I paste these as text, as values, so these are just cell values, and now I'm referenced to a hard-coded value in a cell. So now we can pull out anything we like from using our cube member or our cube value function. Okay, so that's how we use our cube member and our cube value functions. But we've got more. We have cube ranked member and cube value. So cube ranked member, rather than allow us to explicitly state what element we want to use, you can see that we've got calendar, and then day name, and then children. That's all of those items. And then if we say we want the first child from that, that will give us Monday as a response. So let's see how we can use that. I'm going to copy my cube member from here into the other sheet, just to save a bit of time. So we have our cube ranked member equals cube cube ranked member. Again, we're going to connect to this workbook data model. And again, we're going to connect to our calendar table. This time, let's get the days of the week, or the date. So you can see there we have date as an item, and then we're going to connect to the children. So that's all of the items in that dimension. And let's say I want the first item in there. I press return, and that gives me the 1st of October 2018, because that is the first data point that we have. Equally, I could use the 10th, and that gives me the 10th item from that data set. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's great, but we're still explicitly stating things. There are 31 days in October, so wouldn't it be great if we could have 31 days? Only there's 30 days in November, and there's that rhyme that nobody can remember. So actually, if we're going to fill cells with this, wouldn't it be great if we could spill these results? So rather than explicitly having one item, we can use the sequence function. And I'm going to say that I want 31 items, because there's 31 items in October. Now, when this works, you guys are going to whoop, you're going to holler, you're going to bang your hands together. Look at that. It's spilling, it's coming from the data model, and it's spilling out those values. Look at that. That's pretty cool, right? So let's come to our cube value. Equals cube value. We're going to have this work with data model. So if I connect to my cell, D9, let's dollarize that. And we all know about spill references, don't we? C10 hash. Are you ready to whoop and holler? Are you ready? Are you ready? Yeah, it doesn't work. Or does it? In the last session, Alan told us all about lambdas. You're now experts in lambdas, right? I see all your heads nodding. That's good. Because if we want to use a lambda, we could use a bi-row and lambda combination. The problem here is that cube value only works on a single cell, so we can't spill that out. But if we were to use a bi-row, open bracket, select that range, C10 hash, comma, lambda. Actually, sorry, let me F2 that, and then you've got a chance of actually seeing it. So bi-row, open bracket, we want C10 hash, comma, lambda. My parameter will be called R. And then rather than referencing C10, inside our cube value, we're going to reference R. We're going to close it again, press return, and look at that, it now spills the values out. That's amazing, isn't it? But what about the slicers, right? Do the slicers work with that? Let's have a go, shall we? We're getting the right formula. Slicer, color, or primary underscore color. We'll click on our slicer. Look at that, our slicers work as well. So now reaching into our data model, we're spilling out our results, and we've got it connected to a slicer. Yeah, but you haven't got a total at the bottom, have you, Mark? There's no total there. There's no total on those values. Well, we've used a lambda. Why don't we use a let as well? Let's go big. Go big or go home is what they say. So let's use a let. We're going to call our values is going to be our values there. Let's create a variable called total, and we're going to use our cube value to this workbook data model. And what do we want to reference? Well, we want, because this is a total, we want everything from our calendar. So calendar, date, children. We want to connect that to our our KPI measure. We want to connect that to our slicer. I think I've got everything right there. We can close that bracket, and then using a VStack. These are values. comma, total, close that bracket, close another bracket, press return. Oh, I've done something wrong, would you believe it? Right, here's your chance to shout out. The first person wins another prize from Ken. Oh, it's not dollarized. No, that's not it. Cube value, this work with data model, calendar data children, D9, primary answers. Snack total. Let's have a look at my cheat sheet. Oh, I need all. That's why all. It's a total, isn't it? All. 0 points for all of you. 0 points for me as well, though, so we're evens. There we go. Right. So look at the bottom. We now have a total. Yeah, it doesn't format right. Once we click these slices a few times, it will get there. I don't know why, but it gets there eventually. It will format those numbers correctly. So we've now spilled out these values. Fantastic. But we can go further than this, you know. We can use CubeSet and CubeSet count. As I said, there's 31 days in October, so I can spill out 31. But what if it were November or a different month? In that scenario, we couldn't spill out 31 items because we wouldn't have enough days. So this is where we can use CubeSet. So equals CubeSet, open bracket. The connection, again, with this work with data model. And we want to get our calendar date.children. I'll close that bracket and press return. It looks like there's nothing there. It is there, you just can't see it. So let's add a caption on that called date cube. There you go, so we can see where our data is, and then we can use CubeSet count to connect to our cube, and that'll tell us that we have 31 dates in our data set. So now when we come to our sequence function, we can then spill out for the correct number of items that we have. So if the dates were to change, if the data updates, that would then flow through correctly. Now you look at that data set, and you can see people weren't massively enthusiastic about collecting squirrel-based data. They started off with gusto on the 6th. By the 20th, they were bored as anything with going out into Central Park and collecting squirrel-based data. But that data, you go, that's interesting, but wouldn't it be nice to know which squirrel was most active on what day? If we could sort this in some way so that we can find out which day they were most active. Well, we can do that using our CubeSet. So in our CubeSet, we've got some additional parameters in there. We get to sort them, ascending, descending in various ways. Let's use descending. And if we're going to sort them in a descending order, what thing are we going to sort them based on? Well, we're going to use our measure dot average activity score close that bracket. Didn't work. What did I do? I'll put the double quote at the start. That's never going to work. Now, at the minute you're saying, well, you might have sorted something, but how do I know? And that's because our cube, ranked member, currently isn't linked to our cube set. So now let's return this back so that rather than looking at the children, all the children, it's going to look at our cube set. And there we go, we now get that data sorted. So we're now reaching into our data model, we're using formulas to pull it out, and we're using these functions to then sort our data. And then you say, but Mark, look at all these blanks. Look at all nobody wants all those blanks. That's rubbish. That's what you'd say. You'd say it in a very British accent, obviously. Mark, that's rubbish. So what are we going to do? Well, this is where we go slightly crazy. So with our cube formulas, I said they're based on MDX, which means we have this whole world of MDX functions that we can use. And there is an MDX function that returns non-empty values. Now, there is a very high chance, I'll say there's a 73.6% chance I'll get this wrong. So how do we write these MDX functions? We're going to start here. The function we're going to use, there's loads of functions we can use. We're just going to use one of them, and that is non-empty. You'll notice this is going into double quotes. So this is all as text. You'll also notice that there's no IntelliSense for the MDX functions, which means we're flying blind and hoping that we get this thing right. So non-empty. So we're using our calendar, our date, and our children. So that's the complete list of dates. We then want to say, well, how are we determining what empty is? So we need to create what's known as a set and a tuple. I'm not going to go through those. So in this funky syntax here, we can say that we're going to use our measures and our average activity score. So that's the basis by which we know what has values and what doesn't. Press return. And there you go. We now have all of our values. They're spilled out so that in descending order, we have the total at the bottom and a total of 1.49 for all of our squirrel-based activities. Now, what happens if we add more data? What am I doing scrolling to the bottom? He looks like a fool, like he's never used a keyboard shortcut in his life. It's not true, I know at least 5. So let's have a look at our data set. We go data, refresh all. Oh, that is the worst thing that can happen. I have no idea what that error message means, neither do you. I'll click yes anyway. So imagine this in your mind, right? Imagine it. Go away. So what happens is that all this spills down, right? I'm going to do this manually just to show you what it should look like, because that's the best way to update stuff. So on the 31st of October, 2018, you would get a squirrel score of 8.2, and then this value down here would update, and you would all go, Mark, that is amazing. I can't believe you did that using formulas, and the technology worked perfectly. How did you handle that? We'll just slide over that bit. Doesn't matter how many times you practice, the technology can always let you down. So there we go. We've had a look at cube functions. We've reached into our data set. We've seen that pivot tables, they break our hearts. They make us sad because they just lack the power that we need to do anything of any real value. But with using Power Pivot, we can use a pivot table, we can use cube functions, we can connect to Power Pivot, we can connect to Power BI, and if nothing else, if you take nothing away from today apart from this, it's the fact that squirrel is now one of the most mentioned terms in Excel days so far. There you go, squirrel, there's my word cloud. That is a highly mentioned word, a key term that you all need to remember. So these are the functions we looked at: CubeSet, CubeMember, CubeRankedMember, CubeSet count, and CubeValue. There's so much more we can do here with MDX and all this other stuff. The joke about the MDX is hard to learn and hard to master, that wasn't a joke. That is actually true. So there we go. Thank you very much. I have no idea whether I'm on time.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Any questions for Mark?
If the question is what? Then
in the cube functions, Mark, you mentioned the name of the table. Does that automatically change in case the tables change at the back in the data model? The name changes?
I don't believe so. Well, I don't. It's been a while since I've tested it. My guess is no.
Okay.
Or else I'd have been really excited, right?
Any more questions for Mark? Like, how many times did you test it if it actually works?
Say that again?
Or when you were testing, were you also doing it manually?
Does it work?
Did the 31st of October?
Did it work out?
Did it ever work?
Of course it does.
Of course.
If I just type numbers in, it's always going to be the right number. That's the way I work. I get my calculator out, add up the numbers, and then it always works.
Okay, any serious questions for Mark? Everyone's question is, what? What? Why? What? Okay, then give a big round of applause.
Thank you.